Wake up to Ara under the sun. Ara under the sun.
25. That is the number of people who have gone missing at the park since the beginning of the year, with nothing being done or said about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'll lose my job when they find this posting, but I have other things to be scared of at this point, and this needs to get out. I'm a wilderness ranger at Mount Rainier. My job is to walk the hundreds of miles of trail and wilderness in the park looking for problems and helping lost and injured hikers. In the old days, any lost hiker would mean all of us going out together, putting together a search plan, and doing our best to get them home safely. Things are different today, ever since the start of 2022. Whenever a person gets reported as missing, the family is assured we are on it and will do our best to find them, and promise that they will dispatch us to look. As soon as the family is gone, our bosses tell us that they'll have a search and rescue company take over, and if we know what's best for our jobs, we should just focus on checking trail conditions and doing the rest of our jobs. And so, it's gone on since 2022. At first, there were just a few people missing here and there all over the park. It didn't seem that unusual other than our rangers not being involved in the search, but we figured it was some new policy and shrugged it off. More people started disappearing as the year went on, making all of us wonder what was going on and why it had been made clear to us we should keep our mouths shut. Personally, I figured it was just a combination of bad trail conditions from a rough winter, an influx of inexperienced hikers, and the Park Service trying to avoid looking bad when we needed more funding, until last Thursday. It was an overcast day, and I was walking along the trail up to Ipsit Pass in the Carbon River area, humming quietly to myself to pass the time, and wondering how far up I would go before I had to put on crampons when I saw it. Off to the side of the trail, maybe 50 feet into the forest, there was an odd light on the forest floor. At first, I thought the light was just a reflection off of water or some trash someone had left, but as I moved closer, the light didn't fade or change, it just stayed steady. Maybe it was a lost flashlight? I had walked this trail dozens of times and never noticed it before. I knelt down, taking my pack off, and saw that the light seemed to be coming from just under the dirt. For some reason, I felt uneasy. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby on the trail, and saw no one. Shrugging, I reached into the dirt to poke at the light and see what it was. Poking around, I found the corner of a slightly open trap door that was at most only a foot wide on each side. It was camouflaged nearly perfectly. If it had not been left just barely ajar with the light exposed, there is no way anyone would have seen it from the trail. I kept opening it, feeling uneasy, but hoping it was some sort of buried seismometer, or at worst maybe some hiker's idea of a good place to cache food and water for a long trek. Instead, I found the opening to what appeared to be a small burrow of sorts, with an electric camping torch at the corner. I shoved my head down to look inside. The space was small, with enough room for one person if they didn't mind contorting themselves. On the walls of the burrow were dozens of Polaroid photos of people hiking. All of the photos seemed to have been taken very low to the ground. The photos were from all over the park, many dozens or more miles apart. Most of the photos I didn't recognize, but among them I saw a few that I knew for a fact were hikers that had gone missing over the last year. Then my heart stopped. I saw a photo of me hiking along the Ipsit Pass trail around a half hour ago. I heard a twig snap somewhere around me. I took my head out of the burrow and started running down the trail the way I came. I didn't look back or stop until I got to the wilderness cabin near Ipsit Campground. I locked and barricaded the door and waited until another ranger showed up the next morning, not sleeping a wink. I asked him to walk back along the Ipsit Pass trail with me. He was annoyed that I wouldn't say why, but agreed. We spent an hour looking but couldn't find any sign of the burrow. I asked for some time off right afterwards, and my manager seemed very suspicious and demanded to know why. I made up some excuse about my family and didn't tell him or anyone else what I saw. For some reason, I knew that telling them would at best end with me losing my job. I don't know who or what made that burrow, but I think it's taking people at Rainier, and for some reason the government is covering it up. I wish that was the end of the story, but it's not. This afternoon, I saw something glinting from within the air vent on the floor of my kitchen. I thought maybe my cat had stuck another toy in it. I took the grating off the vent to take the toy out. Instead of a cat toy, I found a Polaroid photo, taken low to the ground, of me making breakfast this morning. I've been a park ranger in this stretch of forest for nearly a decade. Most people imagine that life out here is simple, peaceful even, with the only worry being the odd lost hiker or a bear getting too close to the campsites. For the longest time, I thought that too. I'd come out here looking for quiet, for solitude, maybe even some kind of inner peace. But lately, I've been wondering if something else found me. The woods around here are old. They've been standing longer than any of us, and in some places the trees are thick and close enough to block out the sun. I've always loved that feeling, like stepping into another world. But for the last few years, I've been hearing stories, strange, unnerving ones. The older folks in town talk about shadows that don't belong, lights that flicker through the trees when they shouldn't, and a hum so low it settles in your bones. It wasn't until recently that I began to experience it for myself. It started quietly enough. A missing person here, a strange set of footprints there. Every park has a history of people vanishing. We're in a huge forest, after all. But the patterns of these disappearances were strange. Hikers who knew these trails better than anyone would go out for a short walk, only to vanish without a trace. Campers would go out to fetch water from the creek and never return. And I began to notice that most of these cases happened in a specific part of the park, a part that the locals had a name for. They called it the Hollowed Grove. It's a dense area, thick with ancient trees that loom over you no matter where you stand. The soil feels almost soft, like it's been fed by something more than just rain and leaves. It's the kind of place you'd usually only pass through on the way to somewhere else. But people who wander in there have been known to go missing. For years, I shrugged it off, told myself it was just another ghost story, something to keep kids from straying too far from the trails. That was until I saw the lights myself. I was on a late-night patrol, something I don't usually do, but we'd been getting reports of campers hearing strange noises in the woods around dusk. Low, rhythmic sounds that some of them swore were voices. I didn't expect to find much, but as I made my way toward the grove, I saw a flicker out of the corner of my eye. It was a soft, bluish light, barely bright enough to see. At first, I thought maybe it was just another camper's lantern, but there was something odd about it. It was coming from deep within the hollowed grove, in a part where no one had any business being at that time of night. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail and started toward the light, keeping my footsteps quiet and careful. The air seemed to get colder with every step, and the familiar sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, had all but disappeared. All I could hear was this low hum, like the forest itself was breathing. I finally made it to the edge of a clearing, and that's when I saw them. There were 3 lights hovering above the ground in a perfect triangle, casting an eerie glow over the trees and the forest floor. They pulsed in and out like they were breathing. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the harder it became to think. My head started to feel heavy, and my vision blurred at the edges. It was as if the lights were drawing something out of me, feeding on my thoughts. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished. The darkness snapped back, thick and suffocating, and I stumbled back onto the trail, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, maybe swamp gas or something reflecting off the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't get the lights out of my mind. I started asking around, looking for anyone who might have seen them too. That's when I started hearing about the old stories, the ones I dismissed as nonsense when I first took this job. The locals have a name for those lights, the Watchers. They say they're the spirits of the forest, or maybe something older, something that was here long before people. Some believe they're guardians, keeping an eye on anyone who dares to enter the grove. Others say they're hungry, looking for something, or someone to take. I wasn't sure what to believe, but the stories got under my skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those lights, feel that pull, like they were calling me back. A few months after that first encounter, another hiker went missing. A young woman this time, out on a solo camping trip. She'd left a note with a ranger station about her planned route, but when she didn't return, we sent out a search party. I volunteered to go, feeling like maybe I could finally put this whole thing to rest. We searched for days, covering miles of forest, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. We found her tent, her backpack, even her hiking boots, but no sign of her. It was like she'd simply vanished. Then, on the fourth night, we heard the voices. I was with a few other rangers, and we were setting up camp for the night when the sound drifted through the trees. It was soft at first, just a faint whisper, but it grew louder, filling the air around us. It sounded like a song, a low, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. One of the other rangers swore he could make out words, something about a debt and a return. The rest of us just stood there listening, unable to move. When the song faded, the forest was silent again. We packed up and left the area the next morning, but the woman was never found. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that we'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew better. The Watchers were real, and they were still out there watching. After that, I started keeping my distance from the hollowed grove. I'd warn hikers to avoid it, telling them it was easy to get lost or that the trails were poorly marked. Most of them listened, but a few would always wander in, drawn by some invisible thread, and every so often, one of them wouldn't come back. The strangest part is, the disappearances never made the news. No police investigations, no grieving families on TV. It was like these people were being erased, like the forest was swallowing them whole. I started to wonder if anyone else even remembered them, or if it was just me, left with the weight of these lost souls. I tried to leave the park once, figured maybe a transfer would be enough to get the grove and the Watchers out of my head. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, waiting. I'd catch glimpses of the lights in the corner of my eye, or hear that faint melody drifting through my dreams. It was as if the forest had marked me, claimed me as one of its own. So here I am, still patrolling these woods, still listening for that song in the dark. The locals say the hollowed grove is cursed, that anyone who enters it will be drawn back, over and over until they become part of the forest itself. Maybe that's what happened to all those missing hikers. Maybe that's what will happen to me eventually. All I know is, the forest is older than we can imagine, and it doesn't care about our rules, our boundaries. It was here long before us, and it'll be here long after we're gone. And in the end, maybe that's all we are. Stories, drifting through the trees, waiting to be claimed by the Watchers. I've been working as a park ranger for the better part of 15 years. I've seen a lot out here, both the beautiful and the bizarre, but nothing ever prepared me for what I encountered last October in a remote part of the forest we call Alder Hollow. It's one of those places that people seem to avoid, whether they know it or not. Locals pass by without much more than a nod, and even the hikers tend to stick to the trails on either side. I always thought it was just superstition, some old tale to keep kids from wandering too far. They call it the Echoes, and it's a story passed around by the older folk in town. The tale goes that Alder Hollow has a way of luring people in, especially after dark, and that some never find their way back out. When I'd first heard it, I assumed it was just a classic ghost story to scare the tourists, but over the years I started to notice a pattern. Every so often someone would go missing, a solo camper or a hiker with a knack for straying off trail, and more often than not, their last known location would be somewhere near Alder Hollow. Now, as a ranger, I don't like admitting that stories like this get under my skin. My job is to keep people safe, reassure them when they're spooked, and make sure they leave the forest in one piece. But as the leaves began to turn last fall, I found myself assigned to patrol the edge of Alder Hollow. Some hikers had reported strange noises at night, sounds that seemed to follow them, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I figured it was an animal, maybe an owl or a fox, so I set out to check it out one evening just as the sun was setting. The forest was beautiful that night, with the trees turning gold and red, and a mist rising from the underbrush. It had that crisp, clean scent of fall, the kind that clears your head and makes you feel alive. But as I got closer to Alder Hollow, the air grew thicker, and the mist seemed to cling to the ground like a heavy blanket. The usual forest sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, faded away, leaving a strange, unsettling silence. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was a faint, rhythmic whisper, almost like a song, but too faint to make out the words. It drifted through the trees, echoing softly as if the forest itself were humming. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, and felt an odd pull, like something was drawing me forward, calling me into the hollow. I've been trained to ignore things like that, to keep a level head, but this was different. It felt personal, like the voice was meant just for me. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, weaving my way through the trees and into the heart of Alder Hollow. As I walked, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around me like a veil, and I began to see shapes moving in the mist. At first I thought it was just shadows, tricks of the light, but then they started to take form. Faces, half hidden and translucent, staring back at me with hollow, empty eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak, just hovered there in the mist, watching as I passed. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I kept walking, my eyes fixed on a faint glow in the distance. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I realized it was coming from a small open clearing at the center of the hollow. In the middle of the clearing stood a massive alder tree, its gnarled roots twisting out of the ground like ancient bones. The bark was pale, almost white, and it seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. I felt an overwhelming urge to touch it, to reach out and place my hand against the rough bark. As soon as my fingers touched the tree, the whispers stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the hollow. The mist parted, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the fog, ghostly shapes with faces that looked familiar, but were just out of reach, like memories I couldn't quite grasp. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, clothes that looked like they belonged to another time, another era. They stood in a circle around the tree, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and solemn. I recognized one of the faces. It was a man who'd gone missing from a nearby campsite the year before. I'd been part of the search party that looked for him, but we'd never found a trace, not even a footprint. And there he was, standing there as clear as day, looking at me with eyes that seemed sad, almost pleading. I wanted to speak, to ask him where he'd been, what had happened, but my voice wouldn't come. One by one, the other figures raised their arms, pointing toward the tree. It took me a moment to realize they weren't pointing at the tree itself, but at something tangled in its roots. A small, weathered locket, half buried in the ground. It looked out of place, tarnished and worn, but somehow untouched by time. I felt drawn to it, compelled to pick it up, and as I did, a strange warmth spread through my hand, like the locket was alive. That's when I heard the voices again, louder this time, filling the clearing with a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a chorus, a song of loss and longing, of lives cut short and paths left unfinished. I felt a weight settle over me, the weight of 100 stories left untold, and I knew that the spirits of Alder Hollow were trapped, bound to this place by something they couldn't let go. The figures began to fade, dissolving back into the mist, but the man I recognized stayed a moment longer, his eyes locked on mine. There was a sadness there, a sorrow that ran deeper than words, and as he faded, I felt that sorrow settle in my bones. I knew somehow that he wanted me to understand, to remember him, to keep his memory alive. I left the locket at the base of the tree and backed away, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. As I turned to leave, the mist lifted, and the forest came back to life, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl in the distance. I walked back to the trail in a daze, feeling like I'd just woken from a dream. The next morning, I returned to the hollow, hoping to find some trace of what I'd seen. But the clearing was empty, and the alder tree looked ordinary, just another tree in the forest. The locket was gone, and there was no sign of the figures I'd seen, no whispers in the air. It was as if the entire experience had been a figment of my imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the eerie stillness of the woods. But I knew better. I knew that Alder Hollow held secrets, that the stories the locals whispered were more than just ghost tales. The spirits of the hollow were real, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to remember them, to carry their stories back to the world of the living. Since that night, I've made a habit of visiting Alder Hollow once a year, leaving a small token, a stone, a feather, a simple offering for the spirits that linger there.